Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we are back yet again with another incredible episode with another incredible guest. Before we actually get started, I want to give a shout out to everybody that we met yesterday at Thrive. But wasn't that amazing, Landon?
That was great, Thrive. Yeah, very well attended too.
It was incredible. It was in Lehigh. My voice is a little raspy because I have to say we talked to so many, like I talked nonstop. I know that's hard to picture.
What's new? Yeah.
I just talked. There were you guys, y'all know who you are, who I connected with. We just met so many people. I got so many cards and numbers. It was amazing. It was just wonderful. And just to meet everybody who's watched our program and appreciates the content and appreciates the guests that we have. And it was like a love fest. Landon and I just felt incredible. So thank you, everybody. And it was an amazing event. And everybody that, spoke and participated, it was the incredible Heather Gay. It was kind of one of those out of this world kind of a conference. Anything you want to say, Landon, really quickly?
No, it was just really a great conference and met so many nice people. That's the thing about the post-Mormon world is when you get together, boy, there's no lack of talking.
Yeah, no, I'm not kidding. I woke up this morning. I'm like, what's wrong with my voice? Oh yeah, I kind of did this like like all day long. But no, it was amazing. So speaking of amazing, we have another super interesting episode today. I know that you guys may have seen on the newscast, and I think some other places, it's back in the news again. President Nelson rehearsing stories like at conference that have been proven certifiably not to have happened the way that he has described them. The most recent one, and it was said in his final address at conference in October, was the story of a loaded gun being held to his head while he visited a mission president when he was an apostle, and the trigger being pulled and it didn't go off. And, right away we all went, oh my gosh, Mormonism Live has already talked about this. This did not happen. I just saw 2 days ago in the church news that they have released notes or a study guide for President Nelson's talk so that Elders Quorum and Relief Society can go over the talk. And again, they have included notes in that, bullet points of what happened to him. They say a loaded gun was held to his head. Again, this is not the narrative of the story. Even in the Deseret News, what do you have to say about that, Landon? This segues right.
Are you sure they have bullet points? Because I don't think there were any bullets involved.
Oh God, I said bullet points. You're right. Oh, good one, Landon. It's too early for dad jokes. Yes, there were no bullet points because there were no bullets. That's right. So it just got me thinking about all the things that are said that people take as these inspiring stories that other people are like, I want the truth about that. I may be inspired by it, maybe, but I want to know, did that happen? It matters to me whether something happened or not. I don't know if it matters to everybody. I've talked to family members who are in the church that, I've even told them about President Nelson and some of these stories, and they're like, well, as long as it makes people feel good or he gets his point across. So some people have that point of view, but I don't have that point of view. So I came across a post. Yes, we'll finally get to our amazing guest. I know he's like making coffee, he's twiddling his thumbs. I came across a post where somebody was speaking pretty authoritatively about the airplane story. I hope you guys all know what I'm talking about. The spiral of death, plane on fire airplane story that President Nelson has referred to a couple times. So I instantly reached out after I made this post, and this is how we met Jim. Jim, welcome to Mormonish. How are you today?
Good. How are you guys?
We're good. Sorry for that long intro. We had a lot to cover, but no, Jim has a background that is going to make it incredibly interesting to everybody to talk about this story of the airplane of President Nelson. And we know that Mormonism Live has covered this very well, and Jim's going to talk about that. But his background brings some things to this that are really going to be fascinating. And since Mormonism Live covered it, there have been some apologetics that have come out. And that's kind of some of the newer information that we're going to talk about, because it's always very interesting to see how it can be spun by apologists to make sure everybody knows it's okay. It's totally okay. This probably could have happened. So why don't you introduce yourself, Jim, and we will, again, dive right in. All these
dive into it. I'm not what you did there. Well, you forgot to mention that there has been some apologetics, but it's bad apologetics.
Okay,
right?
Use the word bad.
And that's what got me like really worked up about it, because I went to FAIR and I read what they had posted, and I got angry because I was like, this is garbage, right? This is not true. This misses facts. And so I got pretty heated about it and kind of paced back and forth in my house like I do, and made some notes, and then got on Facebook and was like, okay, I got to vent for a second. And so I just vented for a second.
And I found it like I
yeah,
always
and then
do,
you
right?
found it. So
Tell us your background a little bit. Why this was so, I mean, you know things. Let's just say that.
So I got into aviation as a kid. We were living up in Washington State, and we went to like a field trip to an airport. And I remember like sitting there on the ramp, and it was super hot during the day. And the airport manager's like, "No, just it's okay, be patient." I wanted to leave, and then over the trees right there at the airport came this big old World War II bomber. It was a PBY Catalina, so it was like a flying boat. And I just remember as a kid, the sound of the engine and the way it landed and the whole 9 yards, I was like struck. And so I would draw that airplane on like church bulletins and stuff like that, like the opening, the sacrament notes and stuff like that. And I mean, I probably drew it last Sunday, like I've been doing it my entire life. And then as a kid, I got into the Civil Air Patrol when I was about 15. And did like my first flight at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and really got into it and started liking general aviation, like going to local airports and stuff. As I got older, my dad basically made it clear that I would never be a pilot and that it was too expensive, and we would never do that. So I got into music and spent a few years in music, and then went on a mission in about 2002, and was back a little bit after that. I got sick. I went to Roseville, California, and got sick after that, but I really got into professional aviation when I went to college. And so I did my my bachelor's degree studies at Utah Valley University. And I was there just after the 2010 crash. So UVU had a pilot crash in Payson in 2010.
I remember that.
And so I remember being at the school and like hearing about what had happened and talking about crash investigations and how it was handled for the school and what the school had to do in the wake of that incident. That is, relook at all their safety operations, relook at how they did the pilot training, and so that was kind of the environment in 2010 when I started at UVU. I did my master's degree studies in aviation safety at the University of Central Missouri. And that program really focuses very heavily on crash mitigation. So what processes are in place to stop things from happening? And so we look at things like the Colgan crash that happened in Buffalo, New York, the Everglades crash where a commercial airliner had some tanks on the inside of it that came loose during flight, which caused a crash into the Everglades. And so you look at different flights, you look at different plane incidents. Fatal, non-fatal, commercial, non-commercial, and in that program, you kind of go through and look at what are the trends and how are these incidents mitigated in the future? How are they investigated? And so, I first heard about the Nelson spiral of death story in 2010 when I was a student, and I was working at I think the Salt Lake Airport. And we were kind of going back and forth. And my job at the Salt Lake Airport is we would fuel aircraft and we would taxi we would tow aircraft that had come in. And I was talking to a bunch of other guys that worked the line, and we were talking about our flight school experiences or our maintenance school experiences. And there was a plane there that had belonged to I believe it was the Huntsman's. I think it was a Global Express. It was a big private jet. And the rumor had it that the church would use the Huntsman's plane to fly the general authorities around. I'm not sure if that was true, but that was the rumor that we had going on. And we were talking about why it was safer for them to use the Huntsman's private jet, right? It was, there's less people out there. No one's going to try to assassinate the prophet if he's on a private jet, because we believe that people try to assassinate the prophet when you're...
Yeah, exactly.
Which I'm sure somebody has, right? I mean, it's got to be there, right? But still, he's
a global faith leader, so there are those issues. Yeah,
I hated that term.
That's why he needed the Global Express. Yeah,
see, there you go. And so one of the guys I was working with mentioned the fact that one of the leaders of the church had almost been in a plane accident. He was Elder Nelson. We talked about it, and at that point in time, I didn't know enough about how things operated to have that really hit like a red flag for me. But when you're in aviation, you want to tie as much of your life to aviation as possible. So aviators will talk about anything that's associated with their planes or anything that they can talk shop about. Landon knows this because when he and I
Yeah.
first talked on the phone, that was like where we went to immediately was the aviation stuff.
Yeah, and we need to say this. Landon is a pilot, studied, and so to me, I feel like I should just, I don't know, zoom out, go to McDonald's, get a Egg McMuffin, and let Landon and Jim just, I mean, his name is Landon. I'm not taking off, I'm Landon. Have you guys thought about this? So I love this, that the two of you, and you've already had some conversations, can just, you both have this background to really dive into this. What's your official job, Jim, then?
So I worked, I'm the director of new business development for a aviation flight school in my area.
That's great.
Before that, I was the director of aviation maintenance technology for Marshall University. Well,
Wow.
that's where I work now as Marshall.
Yeah, that's great.
Before that, I served as the director of RCBI Aerospace, which was an economic development aerospace group that was grant funded. And that was for the Marshall University Research Corporation. Before that, I served as the deputy director of Huntington Tri-State Airport in West Virginia. Before that, I was operations at Lexington Bluegrass Airport. Before that, I was operations at Salt Lake No. 2. Before that, I was an airport planner for a company called AECOM, where we did airport planning for airports in Los Angeles area, kind of the Southern California area.
Right.
I also hold certifications in airport management, airport field operations, and aviation safety management systems. And safety management systems is the process of looking at a organization, especially an airline, and pre-planning what could happen, what do we know will happen, what might happen, and how do we mitigate those risks. So safety management systems are the same processes that are used by like hospitals and stuff like that to kind of look at what risk could happen and mitigate those. So that's my background. I've had a lot of different hats in aviation. I've been very, very lucky in that I've been able to move to a number of different airports where we've had a history of crashes. So at Lexington, we had a crash there just before I came on a few years. Huntington Tri-State Airport had the Marshall crash, where the movie We Are Marshall is based off of.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Oh, my God.
And so I've been very lucky in that my entire professional career in one way or another has been associated with aviation accidents. I've been able to learn from individuals who are either responded to those crashes or investigated those crashes. And then one of the key things I've done that has allowed me to kind of understand how regulations work is on the airport side, one of my key jobs was to look at airport certification manuals and safety manuals. And I would audit those manuals to go through and say, okay, is the written documentation for the airport meeting what the FAA wants it to mean? And so we would go back and kind of look at each one of those documents. So I have a lot of experience going through and looking at what documentation should exist, what does exist, and then going back through and making sure that the organization I was working for, including when we did the work on developing the schools here at Marshall, that those documentations matched what the FAA required from us as an applicant. So that's where my side of this really ties in.
Right.
So you want to start with the slides then.
Let's do it.
Go ahead and share.
I want to just add, when I got to talk to Jim, I was in heaven. This is he's right down my alley. He went to UVU in their aviation program. I went to Utah State in their aviation program. So I grew up around airports. My father was a air traffic controller at the Salt Lake Airport. I grew up. When he'd work on the midnight shift, I'd go up in the tower with him, and I'd get to spend the night. Now you can't even imagine doing that post 9/11, but that's what we got to do. I'd spend the night up there with him watching that. So I went through the aviation program. I got my commercial license, my multi-engine, my CFI, CFII. Went into the Army because I wanted to do Army aviation, but with my glasses, I wasn't allowed to. And then life circumstances overtook me, so I didn't get to continue flying. So you're living the dream that I always wanted to. But when I talk to you, the important thing to keep in mind here, and that Jim really brings up, is these aviation accidents don't happen in a vacuum. Everybody, when there's an accident, everyone in the aviation community knows about that accident, and they're talking about the accident. What happened? How did it, what could have been done to avoid it? It is known everywhere. And like you said, the student accident at UVU, everyone in Utah knows about that accident. When we had a gear up landing at Logan when I was going to school, everybody knew. Everyone was like, "What happened? What were they doing?" I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. Everybody hears about them. Everybody studies them. Everyone wants to know what happened. And so this accident or described accident, if you want to call it an accident, that President Nelson talks about, should have information. People should know about it. It should be fairly well known. Something of that size, a passenger aircraft landing off field, would be something that the aviation community would definitely know about. And so Jim, as he started going through, and I could tell he knew what he was talking about, and he's put together a presentation that just really shows he's gone through the regulations. And anyone who's not familiar with the FARs, I mean, that book is what, about this thick, of all the requirements and regulations, and you have to pretty much memorize it as an aviation professional. And so he knows what he's talking about. And this is I'm really excited about this because he's really put together a good presentation here.
I'll go ahead and start sharing.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Let's make sure I get this correct. All right. Can you guys see it?
Yeah, we see
Yes,
it.
we
Yeah.
We love
All
your
right,
title.
so
Oh my God.
What we're going to talk about today is known as President Nelson's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad flight. So we're going to talk about what documents support or refute the 45-year-old claim. And I have to kind of explain the cover here. I was watching South Park in a hotel, I think in Wheeling, West Virginia, a little while ago. And this scene came up, and I was laying in bed, I was like, oh my gosh, that's President Nelson. So that's President Nelson from the South Park episode, if you haven't seen it. The other name for this presentation would be, no, sir, that's not history. The Nelson Flight of Death.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we're not going to do, or I'm not going to do, is I'm not going to get too much into, doctrine and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. What we're going to talk about quite simply is, do we have the information we need to corroborate the story? Okay, so that's what we're going to look at. Okay. So the first thing we have to do is we have to thank RFM and Bill Reel, right? I had pretty much forgotten about this until they brought it back up. So I remember hearing about it in 2010. It was kind of in the back of my mind during college because, like I said, everybody in aviation, if it's part of our religion, we want to tie it to somehow the industry that we work in. And so they did the first real legwork on this and kind of blew it wide open and brought it back to my attention. And that's when I kind of started to pay some extra attention to it, like on the side, just trying to dig and trying to find information. So they did great work. And they flat out showed that, from everything that they could find, that the story was nonsense. So what we're going to do then is our goal then is to give greater insight into the event, provide greater context for the claims. So where did the claims come from? What was happening? Who owned the aircraft specifically? What kind of aircraft was it? We're going to provide the context for the documents we have. So we're going to look at look at this document right here. That's from the Civil Aeronautics Board. So most people looking at this incident, they have no clue what the Civil Aeronautics Board is. So we're going to explain why that existed and just say, okay, which alphabet agencies would have touched this event and what documentation would have existed if they had touched it. Okay, so, and then finally, we're going to take a look at the embarrassingly bad apologetic from FAIR, which I can't even begin to describe.
Yeah, it's one of the best parts of the whole episode is as we talk about that. Yeah.
So let's give some. Do you guys have any questions before I get rolling? Because I've got some history slides.
No, I think you're great.
We should say, if you don't know what we're talking about, please go to Mormonism Live and look up the episode on this. It's
I'll put it in the show notes. Yeah, they're very comprehensive.
It's very comprehensive about the story and what was told. Our focus here is more on did he exaggerate?
Nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, the nitty-gritty details and what should be there and why the apologetics is so bad on this.
Yeah, and we will take a look at like how the event was described and the number of times it shows up. Because looking at the number of times it shows up is important, because this kind of went from a story that was told to a core narrative of Nelson's life. Like in 2018, it's every single year since he became prophet, it shows up, boom, boom, boom. So, so some background onto what type of airplane he was on. So the airplane was owned by SkyWest, okay? And so in 1972, there was an airline in Southern Utah called Dixie Airlines. Well, they went out of business. And so J. Ralph Atkin and several other people acquired the lease at the airport that airline had been using, and acquired the rights to the commuter airline to operate in that area. Okay. And so they built what was called a fixed base operation down there in St. George, which is basically a gas station for pilots. You come in, you buy fuel, you can buy candy and food, you can get the catering you need. Okay. So they built an operation that had a flight school and maintenance to kind of cater to the aviation industry in southern Utah. Okay. Now, Atkin is kind of an interesting character because he graduates from BYU. He graduates from the University of Utah. He practices law in southern Utah. And then he would go on to become a PR person for the church. Okay. And so, he's an active member. His family are active members. He's a highly placed attorney. He was a politician down there. So there's no reason why a church leader would not be operating on an airline that's owned by a prominent church member in southern Utah, right? It just kind of makes sense. So March 2nd, 1972, they go for profit. They create Inter-American Aviation that becomes SkyWest Airlines. Okay, so March 2nd, 1972. 1972, they had 3 planes, and they flew their first route from Salt Lake City, from St. George to Cedar City, and then on to Salt Lake on June 19th, 1972. So when the Nelson event takes place, the airline had only been operating for 4 years. Okay, so this is a fledgling business. Okay, more importantly, they weren't even a profitable business until 1976. So when we look at the history, from 1972 to 1976, SkyWest didn't make a profit. 1976 was the first year. And what happened is you had Hughes Air, which was owned by Howard Hughes, okay, had been operating routes between Vegas and Southern California and to Salt Lake. Well, they were given permission by the Civil Aeronautics Board to basically stop flying to Cedar City if they could get another airline to take it over. So SkyWest applied for the rights to start flying the routes that Hughes Air had been operating, okay? And the 1977, they received a stipend or a federal subsidy from the Civil Aeronautics Board of $160,000 a year to start flying those routes. So there's a thing called essential air service, which is where the government pays an airline to fly to small airports to help people in rural communities get access to larger airports. Okay, so where I live in Appalachia, we have several airlines that fly from like Beckley, West Virginia, and places like that. They pick people up in smaller airplanes, fly them to Charlotte or fly them to Yeager or someplace like that, so that people in isolated communities have access to larger airports. So what SkyWest was doing was applying for a air service subsidy to fly these routes back and forth, and that's where the flight came from. That's the history of it. It was a flight that was operated by SkyWest back and forth from Salt Lake as a commercial flight subsidized by the U.S. government. Okay, so and this is the SkyWest fleet right here. This very well may be one of the planes that he was on, because there's a bunch of the Piper Chieftains right here in this picture. So,
and we probably should say SkyWest is a great airline. They've really grown recently. Recently, in the last 20, 30 years, they now do. If you've flown in the Western U.S., United Express, Delta Express, those are operated by SkyWest Airlines. They're a great airline. Nothing here is
superb safety record too. Yeah, safety record.
Yep, they're a great airline. So we want to take that out of it. This incident will even show that it was just a minor incident, not a major.
We'll even show that they received praise from the FAA in 1977 for how safe they were, right? So the idea that they had a major crash a year before they were praised for their safety record, it doesn't necessarily go together. So my question was, where did this story first originate, right? And so the earliest known reference I can find to the story comes in 1979 in Nelson's autobiography. And interestingly enough, the plane crash story is cited as like the thing that gave him his final push to write an autobiography, right? So he, in looking at the autobiography, he says that the motivation to write the review came from his wife at the time, Dancel, and from President Kimball. And then he says, the final nudge came as I was a passenger in a small airplane plummeting earthward with one of the 2 engines exploded. I realized that although both spiritual and material needs of my family had been provided, I had not left for them a reasonable recapitulation of my life that they could review. The safe landing of that disabled aircraft, disabled is important, provided me with the chance I needed. So he cites this. Not only is this an important spiritual thing that's used by the church now, this was what gave him the cause to put his life on paper, right? So he cites this as a major event in 1979. So anything on that?
Well, I mean, as it would be, right? And I still wonder if, he just remembered it wrong. People do that. But still, there's such overwhelming evidence.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about that. So it's cited twice in the book. So page 376, again, November 12th. Now, this book and both of the biographies get the date wrong. Everybody says November 12th. The event actually happened on November 11th.
And what year? Let's make it clear what year
1976.
1976. Because I will point out in this same book, he has a notation that in, 50 years ago from now, so it would have been, 74? Anyway, he got his second anointing on June 9th. He points that out in this book. So by the time he's in the plane, he's already has a second anointing, huh? Assured of, he should be fine. You would think you'd have peace if you have that assurance, right? And maybe that's why he did.
I had no clue about that, really.
Yeah, somebody dissected that, and it said on June 9th in this same book, Denzel and I went to the temple and had a very special ceremony. Someone looked up that date that year, and it was a Sunday. And so they're just assuming that is what he's referring to.
Well, so another funny thing about this book, too, is this is the same one where Nelson wrote the introduction for Kimball and gave it to him. And so we said,
I'm using this.
So he basically comes in and is like, hey, I wrote this. And Kimball's reaction is sure. And then he's kind of like, well, he uses the term fulsome, which means like braggadocious and, overzealous. And, so Kimball kind of notes that the introduction for this book is very fulsome. So it's like he really wrote that well about himself, right? Very, so just kind of a funny little side.
Is this from President Kimball's?
This is from his diaries. Yeah,
that's what I think. Yeah, I think we should read this out loud for our listeners because it's funny. He says,
Landon,
Nelson brought a suggested foreword he had written for me that he would like approval to use in a compilation he had prepared on his life story. He had written a very interesting account of his activities, some of which included experiences with me. Again, this is President Kimball speaking. And I assured him I'd be happy to read it and give him approval to use it. A fulsome foreword for a man to write about himself. Meaning, wow, that kind of takes some nerve. But then again, there was that I saved your life kind of thing. Like
exactly, right?
I saved your life. Yep. And then President Kimball says, then I visited LeGrand Richards in the hospital. So there you go.
That's so crazy. I had no clue at I'd heard the second anointing thing. I didn't realize it was before this took place.
Yeah, well, I mean, if that's true, they just said special ceremony on Sunday, June 9th. And so a lot of people think that's what that means.
So the importance of this story, right? So the first time, and there's a guy named Not Terribly Helpful on the Mormon Reddit who chased all this stuff down. I did not chase down these sources. I looked at what some other people on Reddit had put together and kind of ferreted some stuff out from there. But it shows up in, in 85, 92, 94, 95, 2003. And then if you look at from 2018 on, it's September 3rd, September 16th. The Deseret Book Sherry Do account comes out in 2019. The story shows up again in 2019, just a couple months later. It shows up in August of 2019, then it shows up in 2021.
So some of these are books, some of these are articles, some of these are in the church news. Some are just for those that are listening. These are such excellent slides. You might want to just duck over and watch this on YouTube because it's so good. But yeah, it looks like it just appeared over and over in all the different places where an apostle or prophet's words would appear in the church. From
not only that, not only in articles, but in videos too. It shows up in these dramatized events where they have a picture of him and he's in the plane. Like you can see outside the window and there's a picture of a woman sobbing, and it's all very tied to the Bonneville, heartfelt, what's it called?
Oh, the heart cell. Is that
The
what it
heart
was?
cell thing,
Heart
right?
cell.
It's got
Yeah,
the
it was
dramatic music.
right.
Yeah.
Strategy
So-
to talk to your heart, right? Not
yeah.
your head, but your heart.
So
Obviously, when he becomes the church president, the story becomes more prominent and told more often to promote and sell him as the prophet in his experience. So
correct. Yeah.
you can definitely see it speeds up in how often it's presented once he's the church president.
Okay. So now the image on here, this is what an engine fire on a Lycoming engine should look like. Okay. So this is not from the crash. This is stuff that we've worked on here, and I've had friends work on in other places. So what are the descriptions of the event? Okay. And the descriptions of the event are very, very, very important because it tells us it tells us what we should be looking for in the documentation. Okay. So in every single account, he's traveling from Salt Lake City to St. George to give the invocation for one of the the new president of the school. And so what I did is, for the previous notes, I just went and I took the language used in those different accounts. Okay. So you have the engine caught fire. It suddenly exploded, suddenly burst open and caught fire. Now, it blew up and the plane caught fire. Burning oil was poured all over the right side of the airplane, spewing burning fuel all over the wing, flaming fuel all over the right side. Okay. So, and
these are President Nelson's words as he writes it, or is the transcript in a video. These are the words he uses to describe his own experience.
Yeah. And you can go back to the Easter message from 2021 where he's speaking to the camera. And he uses the exact same terminology. So yeah, this is his narrative. And then for some reason or another, the pilot switches off the number 2 engine for some reason. He just shuts it off. So now they have no power in the plane, which doesn't make sense. We'll talk about later.
I remember you saying something about that, Landon. You were like, from my experience, I can't understand why that would be part of the protocol that you would. It
does not make sense.
When I was obviously, if you had an engine fire, it would make sense to turn off the fuel to the engine that has fire. You're saying he turned off the fuel to the engine that remained running, which is completely the opposite of what you would want to do, because you want to keep the plane in the air and you want to keep the engine that has power going. Yeah.
So what you would do, right, is every airplane has a checklist. Every airplane has this response. There's an engine failure on the ground, engine failure in the air, engine fire protocols, and if you kill the engine, you're gonna cant that airplane. You're gonna position that airplane for the best airspeed, right? And you're gonna feather the prop and the engine that's gone. And feathering means you're taking the blades and you're turning them so that they don't create drag. And then you're gonna land the airplane as quickly as possible, which we'll see is what they did. Okay, so going on in the narrative, the explosion of the engine and the turning off of the other engine then puts the airplane into either a steep dive or a stall-like spin. Okay, and so spinning down to our death, the spiral dive extinguished the flames. The plane spiraled towards the earth. Miraculously, the dive extinguished the fire. We dropped in a steep spiral dive. Now, we'll talk about, there is a dive called an emergency descent, which we will talk about because I've had apologetics say, well, the pilot obviously did an emergency descent. No. Okay. And then finally, the airplane made an emergency landing in a farmer's field. The pilot was able to regain control and bring us down safely, so that the wording there is crash landing in a field. The idea that the pilot was able to get the airplane under control gives us the message that this was an out-of-control aircraft, right? So the pilot was able to regain control. So the way it's presented is this explosion, this spin. The aircraft is beyond the active control of the pilot, okay? And the pilot is wrestling with the plane to get the plane back in, gets it miraculously just before they're supposed to hit the ground, okay? So those are from the church news articles and whatnot. So the next slide then would be the official biographies, okay? And the official biographies is, to me, this is where this carries the weight, because this is what was commissioned to teach future generations about his life. A lot of people will not see the church news articles, but they will get this book as a gift, right? And so this is what's designed to really form people's opinions of it. Okay. So in this one, it's the same narrative. The engine exploded, spewing oil all over the right side of the aircraft and bursting into flames. In an attempt to douse the flames, the pilot turned off the fuel, causing the plane suddenly to go into a free fall death spiral. Miraculously
Landon's laughing.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens when you turn off the fuel. The plane just rolls over and goes straight to the ground.
So on Friday, I was actually with a guy who I work with who is, he's an aircraft mechanic. He's a former Navy guy. He and I have worked together for several years. And I let him read this, and he started laughing. He's like, was he in the Memphis Belle? Like what? Because there's a scene in the movie Memphis Belle where the engines are on fire and they do a dive to try to put out the flames, right? And so everybody I've talked to goes, is this Memphis Belle? So if you haven't seen Memphis Belle, watch it. It's fantastic. So in the nick of time, the pilot was able to start the left engine, regain control of the plane, and glide it to an emergency landing in a farmer's field not far from Delta. Okay, so that is the Sherry Dew account. There is the other biography of Nelson by Spencer Condy, and that is the engine on the right wing burst open into flames, spewing oil all over the right side of the plane. The whole engine was on fire. When we went into an earthward dive, I assumed that my life was going to be terminated right there. The poor lady across the aisle from me was in absolute hysterics. She was right there where the flames were brightest. Okay. So not only do we have fire, but like the way he describes it, this is lapping flame that's coming out of the engine up over the wing, like bright fire. So
yeah, it sounds like he's on the left side of the plane, and the flame is so big he can see the right side. He can see it through the window on the right side of the plane. Yes. So this is flame that is big enough that someone on the opposite side is seeing this flame going off.
Yeah, which would cause all kinds of structural damage on the inside of the engine and to the cowling, because those engines are encased in a cowling, right? These aren't like open radial engines from World War II. Everything on that, so the fire would have to be spewing out of the cowling and up over the wing. This would have been a big fire. So let's see here. But the pilot had turned off the ignition that fed more gas to the fire and had purposely been in a steep dive, hoping that the flames might be extinguished, which is what happened. And just as we were about to have our moment of impact, so just before they hit the ground, he was able to glide us following a highway until we could make an emergency landing. Okay. So when we get to the apologetic later, keep in mind, there's all these sources out here that have all kinds of details that FAIR doesn't even touch, right? It is radioactive to them, right? So this is the plane in question. This is the exact plane that we find in our documentation. This is a picture that was featured by RFM, so I did not find this image. But this is a 1970s model Piper Navajo Chieftain, carried no more than about 9 passengers. And so this would have been one of the first 4 operated by SkyWest in 1976. And no, that is not Nelson. So any questions on that before we start moving to the really boring stuff?
Yeah, no, this is where it gets really exciting. I just wonder about, corroborating all these different sources. They're writing these articles, making these videos, writing these books, and every account is slightly different. Is there nobody that takes notice and said, Sherry, we better not write this way in this book because he said this before? I mean, the church's own sources are at odds with each other. I just don't know where's the correlation for once.
It works great if you're trying to keep people on doctrinal track, but it's not necessary for this presentation.
Yeah, and they probably figure nobody's going back and checking. What were you going to say, Landon?
I was going to say, is Sherry actually saying, it literally reads better this way if we add this or that? But we already, previous to the book, we have accounts where the engine exploded and other things. So it doesn't seem that it's Sherry Dew that's saying, this makes it read better, or we'll sell more books this way, because he's been telling this story with the engine exploding and the fire and everything prior to that in the other documents that we have.
Yeah. So this is where my inner nerdiness kind of kicks in, right? So the question that we're now going to look at. So everything that we just covered, RFM nails all of that. So let's make sure that they get all the credit in the world. So given the elements that have been put into the public by Nelson, by the church through its own publications and through the biographers, we now have to look for data that will corroborate the following information. Okay, so we're looking for a commercial multi-engine aircraft in Utah in November of 1976. It has to include the explosive incapacitation of the right engine. Okay, the resulting loss of positive control of the aircraft, resulting in a stall spin or a free fall, or the initiation of an emergency descent maneuver by the pilot, and then the regaining of positive control of the aircraft just before they hit the ground, and a single engine emergency landing in a farmer's field. Okay, so we have items that we can now search for. Okay, so if these documents were to exist, where would we find them? Well, we would find them in the accident investigation records of the National Transportation Safety Board. Okay, so every accident, this is where it's going to end up. So for people who don't know alphabet agencies, the NTSB was created within the Department of Transportation at the federal government level in 1966. And by 1974, they realized that the NTSB as an investigative agency was conflicting with the FAA, right? They were investigating each other and there was conflicts and who had authority for what and how they should operate. So by 1974, they passed what was called the Independent Safety Board Act, which took the NTSB and made it its own independent body. Okay, so it is not responsible to anybody else. Okay, the NTSB's responsibilities are to investigate all transportation accidents. So if you have a train crash, they're going to cover the train crash. Okay, they're going to cover your aviation accidents. They're going to go cover maritime boat accidents. That's what they do. Transportation safety. Okay. They investigate accidents. They're going to look at each accident and develop a probable cause. So they're going to look at the accident and say, okay, what happened to cause this crash? And then they're going to go from there and they're going to put forth recommendations as to how to stop that same incident from happening again. Okay. And then they're going to study transportation safety issues, take a look at past recommendations and make sure that everything's working. And then they're going to evaluate the effectiveness of the government's own operations on safety. Okay, so very, very big organization. The aviation investigation side of it is just one part of it. Okay, but if there's an aviation incident, it's going to go to the NTSB. If the NTSB is too busy, then they will go to the FAA and they will say, will you investigate this on our behalf? And then the FAA investigator becomes kind of an extension of the NTSB. This happened just south of me here in Logan, I think 2 or 3 years ago, when we had a helicopter crash. And the investigator for that was my FAA friend here in town here. So it's a very good process. A lot of really good people do a lot of amazing work, but the documentation is always there. So there is in the NTSB records, okay, and in the CFR, which is the Code of Federal Regulations, that requires all aviation operators and aircraft owners to report an in-flight fire no matter what. It doesn't matter if you're a small pilot who's flying between your house and your farm, but especially if you're a commercial operator and you're carrying for passengers, the federal law required in 1976 that any operator report an in-flight fire. So CFR Title 14, Aeronautics and Space, Chapter 3, Part 430. That's the stuff I love, right?
Yep. That's why I said you memorize the manuals.
That's right. Rules pertaining to the notification and reporting of aircraft accidents. It says right here at the top, it says the operator of an aircraft shall immediately and by the most expeditious means available notify the nearest Transportation Safety Board, Bureau, Aviation Safety Field Office when. There's a whole bunch of different things here, but number 4 is for an in-flight fire, period. That's it. So we know from the descriptions, we had a major in-flight fire, an explosive fire, in fact. SkyWest's immediate action would have been to report that as an in-flight fire, which means it would have created an investigative record. Now, in the notification to the NTSB, they list out what has to be given to them in the event that this happened. And it includes the type and registration of the aircraft, the name of the owner and the operator of the aircraft, which in this case would have been a Piper Chieftain owned by SkyWest, the name of the pilot in command. So who was the pilot? And because the NTSB is going to investigate the pilot. They're going to look at their background, their training. Did the pilot do something wrong? Is this pilot error or is this maintenance error, right? The date and time of the accident, the last point of departure. So in this case, the name, the date and time of the accident would have been November 11th, 1976. The last point of departure would have been Salt Lake City. The position of the aircraft with referential to geographic points would have been just north of Delta, Utah. And the number of people on board, okay, and the nature of the accident. So there's all kinds of information that should show up on an NTSB document, okay?
And I want to just point out, my dad being an air traffic controller, that, anyone who says, well, maybe they just didn't report it. If this is an in-flight fire and he's making an emergency off-airport landing on a commercial flight plan, he would have declared an emergency with the air traffic controllers. The FAA would have known about this incident. There would have been no getting around that this would have been reported, because the FAA would have known that an aircraft on a commercial flight plan had just gone down and made an emergency landing with a fire on board.
Yeah, and so if you look at the document here, one of the things it says, an aircraft is overdue and it is believed to have been in an accident. So if this thing went down a field, it never showed up in St. George. So at some point in time, even if it wasn't reported, who doesn't report? I mean, especially if you are a small operator who's only been in business for 4 years, okay? And you are in the middle of trying to get a contract from the federal government for a federal subsidy to fly more routes. And this one just doesn't get reported. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. And I actually have a slide talking about that, because there was a flight, an aviation crash on November 12th, 1976, the day after Nelson claims this happened in Brigham City, that did get reported. And I've got all the information for that. So we're going to look at that here in a second as well. So using the NTSB database, okay? Now this is taken directly from the page. We're going to look for all aviation accidents from November 1974 to November 1976, okay? And we're going to set our search information for all event types. So all accidents, all injury levels, so fatal, serious, minor, everything. All aircraft categories specifically for fixed wing, okay? All damage levels, destroyed, substantial, minor. We're going to set the number of aircraft engines to 2, because we know this is a multi-engine incident, and the aircraft type is a reciprocated engine. So reciprocated means it's got pistons, it's got cylinders, it's not a jet engine, okay? So that's our search criteria for the NTSB database.
And anyone could go online and do this, right? Yeah. This is open to anybody. So
yep. So all you have to do is go to Google and type in NTSB search database, and it'll take you to a system called Carol, and you can go and you'll pull the exact same information. So looking at this, so we're looking at 1974, 1977. We've got several events that did take place. They are in Salt Lake, Tremonton, Kings Peak, Bullfrog, Salt Lake again, Logan, and Riverton. Okay, nothing in Delta.
So these are all the accidents from 77, or from what year was it again? 74, 74 to so 4 years. You can see there's not a lot of them, right?
No.
So when something happens, it's known in the aviation community, because this only happens once or twice a year.
Yeah, and the thing is too, aviation, it's a big deal, right? So like we'll talk about here in a little bit, if an airplane goes down a farmer's field, there's going to be pictures.
Yep.
Right. A news reporter who's got nothing to do is going to be like, oh my God, there's a plane in the field. And then if you add the fire that airplane possibly was carrying a general authority, who's not going to write a newspaper article about that? Yep. Right. So we're missing not only the NTSB stuff, but we're missing the social context information that should exist following it. Okay. So on this sheet, these are all multi-engine aircraft. There's a couple Pipers on there, but none of these are the Nelson incident that should exist in this search, given the parameters and the documentation given to us by the church and the information on the aircraft. So Next slide. So there were actually some recorded accidents in Utah in 1976 as well. Well, what I did is I took away the multi-engine requirement for the search, and I came up with a couple more as well, okay? But what I want to look at here is this Brigham City flight. So this was a single-engine aircraft, but some of the specifics are very similar to the Nelson crash, okay? So Brigham City and Grantsville. This is what the summary of the NTSB document for a Nelson crash should look like, okay? So if you were to pull it up on the NTSB, this is what you would see. You would see the NTSB identification here, okay? It's going to talk about the type of aircraft. So Cessna 210 is going to give the registration for the aircraft. Name of airport where they were operating from. So your departure city in this case was Brigham City. Type of incident, engine failure or malfunction. Sound familiar? Pilot data, the pilot was 52 years old. He had 500 total hours. The phase of operation, and this crash was final approach, but in the Nelson crash would have been in flight. Probable causes. So it lists what the probable cause was. And in this one, it is the pilot in command mismanaged fuel, which led to complete power loss, complete engine failure, flame out, and a forced landing off airport on land. Okay. If the Nelson event had happened the way described, this document would exist with a lot of the very same elements. Okay. So
absolutely would exist. Yeah. It's required to exist for this story to be true.
That's right.
What do they say? The lack of evidence is not evidence.
Well, look, if we were like Rod Meldrum's group, we would say, well, obviously they're hiding the truth because they don't want people to know. I shouldn't dig at Rod Meldrum. He's a nice man. So this is what the full NTSB report would look like. So the first slide, that was our summary. This is actually a NTSB report from December 8th of 1977 for a United Airlines crash in Kaysville. Okay. And so this gives you your report number, your title. It states which airline, what type of aircraft, the tail number, and where the crash took place. It gives an abstract. So a half a page abstract describing what happened for that crash. Okay, so this document should exist. This document does not exist. Well, what other information would be in the NTSB report that we could look for, right? So this is the table of contents for the Kaysville crash. And what we've got is it'll have the history of the flight, injuries to person, damage to aircraft, personnel information, aircraft information, what the weather was like, what kind of navigation they had, the flight records, so black box, any sort of information from the tower, communication. All of this stuff should exist in a document, which we're beating a dead horse here. This does not exist. Okay, for every other crash in Utah from 1974 to this one in December of 1977, we have NTSB documentation that shows that it happened, it was investigated, gives us all the background information. And some of those are commercial flights, and some of those are not commercial flights. It's just some guy who ran out of fuel. So if the guy in Brigham City who runs out of fuel and lands off the airport gets an investigation, but SkyWest as a commercial operator does not, no, that's not the way reality works.
Yeah, and I think that's important because I've heard people say, oh, it sounds like it was just a small plane and it was just, probably not something you'd have to report on. But you're telling us this is a small plane, but it's a commercial plane and everything gets reported on. It doesn't matter that it was a short flight, small plane, not at all. It's in the system. It should be there.
Yeah. Small plane operating under commercial service, which means people were paying them money to be on that flight, which means they're actually held to a higher safety standard, right? Because they were operating under, I think, I won't get into the regulations, but this incident put passengers at risk, which automatically is going to elevate that. Okay.
And we keep calling it a crash, and people might say, well, it wasn't a crash because they made a landing. Okay, he said he landed off airport in a farmer's field. So by definition, that would be a crash. If you landed with a fire off airport, even if you want to say he landed on airport, again, the fire, which we know he did land on airport, the fire itself would have made this report necessary. It doesn't matter that he landed in a field or on the airport. even if it was a safe landing, it's still an incident that is required to be reported.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, a fire is so like a fire is one of the things in aviation where that's pretty much the kiss of death if it's not under control. That's why when we train aircraft mechanics, we have an entire section in the Part 147 training for aircraft mechanics, which is just fire suppression. Right. We teach them how to work on the fire suppression systems in the engines and the aircraft itself. And so that's why the NTSB requires that reporting, because if you have an uncontrolled engine fire, your fuel tank is right there. It's in the wing. And so it doesn't take much for a serious fire to burn through a firewall and take an aircraft down. Okay. So the very fact that they do happen escalates that, because when you have an aviation accident, it's not just a threat to the pilot. And it's not just a threat to the passengers. It's also a threat to the people on the ground underneath the flight path. Okay. And we saw that with the Colgan crash in New York, in Buffalo several years ago, where a aircraft had a bunch of safety issues and it spiraled into a neighborhood. Okay. So any event that risks the safety of an aircraft is not just a threat to people in it, it's a threat to the people on the ground. And so a fire is one of those things which will take an aircraft down every time. So it is treated very, very seriously. So the Nelson claim elevates that to one of the highest issues that can possibly happen when you're flying. Okay, so that's why it's so egregious that this story is out there the way it is. So using the details, as we've said, provided by Nelson, the church's biographers, would this have been investigated by the NTSB? Yes, because then and now the NTSB requires mandatory reporting of any in-flight fire, which would have elevated this to an investigation, which would have produced a searchable record. Okay, so what records do we have to support the story? No, there's no.
None. Pretty clear on that.
So what we do have. So let's just discuss the document that we do have. Do you guys have any questions on any of that before I go forward?
No, I think this is just great. You're really explaining it, because I think even I kind of thought, well, maybe you don't have to with a small plane, but you have explained that this is just as serious as what they would treat something that would be big and in the news. It's all taken very seriously.
When I would think about this, when I was younger, it would kind of nod at me, because I was learning in class everything that should happen, and I remembered this story. And as a member, you are taught to give the benefit of the doubt to anything that's said by the church. Okay. And so I went through that same process where I was like, maybe there is some regulation I don't know about that it wasn't required, or, I had rationalizations that I just didn't know enough about the subject to make a decision on it. There was always some reason for me to go, well, obviously there's a reason, and the church has a good reason. And so that's what you're trained to do. Anytime something comes up, you're trained to just say, well, I don't know enough about this, and so I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to have faith.
You do your own apologetic kind of on it, and you blame yourself. I don't know enough, because the church would never mislead. You can't entertain that fact at all. So
and certainly, who would make up a story like this and put it out in public in front of thousands of people if it didn't happen?
So on that, right, in 1979, when this was first published in his biography, it would have been very difficult to come across this documentation unless you knew where to look, right? You would have had to go to the NTSB and request the information. If you went to SkyWest and asked for their safety record, they're not going to give it to anybody, right? And so when Nelson told the story initially, especially through the 1990s, this documentation was not as readily available as it is now. So the problem we have with this is that the story's been retold over the years into this narrative of, look at how spiritual I am. The covenant path gives you this peace when you're faced with this tragedy around you. It's like the gunshot story.
Yeah.
You're awash with peace. You're on a higher plane, and it sets Nelson and church leaders up as the people. If you want peace in your life, this is who you have to be, right?
So let me ask one thing just to make it clear. What's the time frame between the first time the story is reported and when it happened? Because in my mind, I thought, maybe he just misremembered. I've done that. I'll tell a story from high school 40 years ago, and maybe I get some details wrong. But what's the window there?
3 years.
3 years. And that's what I thought I had added up. So 3 years. most of us are pretty clear on something that happened 3 years ago. We can tell it pretty accurately.
Well, and this story impacted him in such a way that he decided to write a book about it. He was so frightened about his potential death. That's not something you just forget about and then remember. Oh yeah, remember that airline flight thing? You know, that's something you tell over and over to your family, to your friends. Maybe it first publicly got produced 3 years later, but certainly something like that you would have been telling to your friends, to the other general authorities. This would be a story that would be retold. And knowing the church, there is no way that an apostle goes down in a crash landing in Utah and it not get picked up by Deseret News, and the story told as this faith-promoting, God saved the prophet, or the apostle, or whatever he was at the time. He may have just been a general authority at the time. But that kind of story, the church would have played that up like that. You'd have heard about it right away.
Well, yeah, and so we'll actually get to that later on, where we talk about what other documents are missing. And you're exactly right. It doesn't show up until his biography and his autobiography in 1979. So the information that we do have, comes from a single reference to SkyWest's application for an air service contract from the Civil Aeronautics Board. Okay. And the Civil Aeronautics Board, it doesn't exist anymore. It went out of business in 1985. Before 1985, the aviation industry was heavily regulated. Okay, so it wasn't the kind of capitalistic free-for-all we have now. The CAB was responsible for setting airline routes. So if Southwest wanted to fly a route from Kansas City to Seattle, they had to.
Everybody.
Yeah, deregulation is why we can all afford to fly nowadays, because you couldn't. It was expensive to fly pre-1985. When they deregulated, then competition was able to take off, and that's why we all can get cheap routes a lot now.
So
you said take off. Competition takes off.
The CAB. Yeah. So the CAB would tell you where you could or could not fly. They would tell you how much you could charge for each flight. And then, they were also involved in safety regulations as well. So when the airline system is deregulated, the CAB goes away because it wasn't necessary anymore. The government didn't control who could fly what routes, and the government didn't tell you how much you could charge for a flight. So this is the reference. Okay, this is the same one that RFM covered, and I think Nemo covered it as well. And it has reference, and we'll explain the background of this, but it explains the incident. So second incident occurred November 11th, 1976, involving the Piper PA-31 with the tail number. Pilot experienced rough running engine on scheduled flight. Scheduled flight means it was for profit, okay? And they bought tickets. More importantly, it was a ticketed scheduled flight. Between Salt Lake City and St. George, 3 passengers on board. Engine was feathered and precautionary landing made at Delta, Utah per instructions in company manual. Investigation revealed cylinder base studs sheared, and we'll talk about those in a second as well. As a result of the current SkyWest changed maintenance procedures by checking torque studs at each 100-hour inspection. That just means every commercial aircraft has an inspection every 100 hours. Okay, you pull it out of service, you go through, there's an entire checklist from the manufacturer. And so every 100 hours, then they added an additional inspection to make sure that they were looking at the studs on the cylinder.
So if this happened right here, what would you have felt in the plane? Would there been a little shimmying, or, what? I'm still just trying to understand if he really thought his life was in danger just from some of the physical sensations that he was feeling.
We're going to talk about that. I have a slide on what a rough running engine feels like. So no damage to the aircraft, no injury to the crew. And it says after the second incident, Lycoming service. So Lycoming is the engine manufacturer. Lycoming service representatives schooled all pilots on proper operation of Lycoming engines. An investigation found that company was operating engines in accordance with Lycoming recommendations. And this is important. All occurrences were reported on SDRs. So an SDR is a service difficulty report, which means the FAA knew that this happened. They told the FAA about the rough running engine, and the FAA said, "You're good. Don't worry about it." Okay. So that shows you what a minor level event this was. It was reported on a routine maintenance form, and there was no higher investigation than that. So let's go to the next slide. So context for this letter. Gosh, I'm dying today.
That's what happens when you podcast. You keep talking and talking, and then you're coughing.
Yep. So like we said before, Hughes Airways canceled their service. In order to stop flying to St. George under the current regulations, they had to have SkyWest come in and take over that route. So there's a letter dated from March 28, 1977 from the Civil Aeronautics Board to the FAA. And the Civil Aeronautics Board tells the FAA that Hughes Airlines is leaving the route and that the existing contract is going to be picked up by SkyWest. The CAB requested that the FAA put together a report on the safety of SkyWest because Page, Arizona, which was going to be receiving service, raised several safety issues and concerns that they had about SkyWest. They didn't necessarily want SkyWest flying there, okay? So when Hughes Airways said, we're not going to fly there anymore, each city had the opportunity to respond to Hughes and try to provide reasons why Hughes should stay or should leave. So the return letter from April 1977 contains the reference that we've seen. So it was a correspondence between the CAB and the FAA, where the CAB had asked the FAA to do kind of a safety review of 3 specific incidents raised by commissioners in Page, Arizona.
And is that the only place we find that then? That's the only place. It's just another airport said, how's your record? And they're like, it's great. This little thing happened and this little thing happened and here's that, but otherwise great. Right. Wow, that's how minor it is. That's what you're trying to say, how minor it was. Okay.
Yep. The letter states specifically that the FAA saw no safety or maintenance related reasons for the Civil Aeronautics Board to deny SkyWest the $160,000 subsidy that came in 1977. Okay. So what this document tells us about the incident is SkyWest had 3 engine failures related to specific components on Lycoming engines. Okay. So in this one, it was the bolts that hold the cylinder to the engine core. And another one, it was counterbalance weights in the engine that came loose. Incident number 2. So November 11th, the pilots experienced a rough running engine. This just means that the engine was still running. It was still operating. It just wasn't operating to the normal parameters. Okay, so there was no explosion. A rough running engine is not the same thing as an incapacitated engine. Okay. The pilot, in accordance with company instruction manual, it says, in accordance with the company instruction manual, shut off the engine, feathered the prop, which means he rotated the propeller so there was less drag, and made a safe precautionary landing in Delta. Now, precautionary means that you are taking actions in order to prevent something from happening. Okay, so I check my safety cams and look both ways in my car and turn around when I back my truck up. That's a precautionary action to make sure I'm not running over bicycles or children, right? So the word precautionary is all we need to know. The pilot landed to err on the side of safety, okay? He probably could have kept running a rough running engine and just had it sputtering and whatnot while he went. But no, he said, okay, we have an engine issue. I'm going to turn it off and I'm going to go ahead and land and we're going to have somebody else come out and get you. That's it.
And so they landed somewhere different. Yeah.
I want to point out that is every pilot, every multi-engine pilot has rehearsed that thousands of times. And you learn it right from the start. I remember when I was getting my multi-engine rating, we were taking off and the instructor reached over and he pulls back the power on one of the engines. That's what instructors do. They try to throw you off and see how you react. So you've got one engine down and, I'm just learning multi-engine. My first reaction, turn the aircraft around. We were taking off. We were just climbing out, turn around, try to make it back to the airport. And he goes, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm returning the airport. He's like, "Why? You've still got an engine. This thing will climb." And he demonstrated to me. He climbed it out with one engine. You've got the power to make a landing. One engine is not a problem when you're a trained multi-engine when you have the rating, you know, I've got the power. I'm okay. I can make, I don't have to make an emergency landing, set the aircraft up, get everything under control, go through the procedures, and then return and make a landing. Obviously, if you're down one engine, you're going to make a precautionary landing. I mean, that just makes sense. But you can do it in an orderly manner. You're not going to be panicked. You've experienced this thousands of times in your training and from your other instructors and all your tests when you get tested. This is a normal procedure for multi-engine aircraft.
And every aircraft has, like, it's called a pilot's operating handbook, right? It's a POH. And in the POH, there is a set checklist. You know exactly what's going to happen. Okay. When I was in flight school, right, it was the same kind of thing where we're up over, where were we? We were out just west of Lake Utah, or Utah Lake, right? We're up flying, and the pilot takes the throttle and pushes the throttle, and he's like, or out, and he goes, okay, you've lost an engine. Where are you going? Right? And you're looking around for places to land, but it's trained over and over and over again. You do it over and over and over again. And when you do your pilot certifications, when you're taking your check rides, the FAA is going to do it to you. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is not a panic-stricken event. So the next slide is
every test, they're going to pull the engine on you. You know that. There's a reason it's going to happen. Yep.
but in this case, they did land somewhere different than they were supposed to land. And that's just protocol. But they landed not in a field, but at another airport. So it's just so, I just don't understand the elements of the story that are just so not what happened.
So to answer your question from earlier, what does a rough running engine feel like?
Yeah.
Okay. So take into account this is the engine that was on the aircraft. Okay. This is the Lycoming 0540. As these pistons are operating, they're synchronized. Okay. So when you have a problem in one of the cylinders, it's going to throw off the synchronization that's going back between those pistons, which is going to cause a hell of a shimmy. Okay. So a rough running engine and a reciprocating engine is going to feel noticeable shaking, noticeable vibrations throughout the entire aircraft. Okay. Because what's happening is the engine is trying to maintain power and smooth combustion across all the cylinders, and that's not happening. And so all of these are powered appropriately, except the one that's underpowered. And what you're getting is a shift back and forth of the power. So it's going to be jerky. It's going to be unstable. There's going to be a knocking sensation, right? You're going to feel it you're going to feel it in the plane. And so that's what they would have experienced is that sudden jerk, that rocking feeling, the inconsistent power. They would have heard it. It would have sounded like a bad lawnmower, like wow, that's going to get picked up somewhere.
So when something like that happens on a small plane, would there be any direction for the pilot from the pilot? Would the pilot say, ladies and gentlemen, we're having a little bit of something and we're going to do this? Would he say, you're all going to die. You're all going to die. I hope you're at peace and okay with God because you're on the covenant path. I mean, would there be any instruction that would tell the people what was really happening?
So yes. Now I don't know because I don't have SkyWest manuals.
Right.
But the pilot's going to come on and he's going to say, look, okay, we've got a small engine issue.
Yeah.
Nothing to worry about. What we're going to do is we're going to make a precautionary landing. We're going to get you to where you need to go on time. We're going to call the plane out. And then his focus is going to be to fly the plane, right? When you're in flight school, that's one of the first things he'll tell you is fly the plane.
But he would have said something to the passengers because that's what I don't understand. Nelson would have gotten some kind of accurate information from the pilot. So then at what point does the mind just go, oh, but I think there's a fire, but I think there's he would have been told this sounds weird. I know you guys might be nervous, but it's going to be okay. It's nothing.
Yeah. Well, I think too, you have to keep in mind, this is not an enclosed cockpit. The passengers can see the pilot. They can see what he's doing.
Oh, that makes a difference.
They probably heard him say, oh shit, when it, and they see him up there starting to flip through the manuals. So as a passenger, you might be concerned, but you're not in a death spiral. Die. The pilot's got it under control. It's still level flight, but you're going to see some action happening from the pilot as he's trying to figure out what's happening.
And consider this: there's only 3 passengers on that plane.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's every chance in the world that at least 2 of them were sitting right behind the pilot when it happened.
Yeah.
This wasn't a crowded plane. So what exactly did cause the rough running engine issue? Okay, so specifically, these bolts right here. Okay, so these are cylinder bolts that attach the cylinder to the engine core. And the purpose of these bolts is to hold the cylinder, the gasket, and the engine core together to create a seal so that combustion can happen effectively within the cylinder. Okay. This is not an uncommon maintenance issue. You can get cracked cylinder bolts from over tightening them when you're putting it on, or under tightening them. So if you over tighten the bolts on the bottom and you under tighten the bolts on the top, you're going to get vibration, and the vibration in that can crack these bolts. Okay. Now, the official account doesn't tell us how many were broken. Okay. But the odds of it being every single one of them is very, 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 very small. Okay. So what probably happened is when they were doing some work on it, they removed the cylinder, put on a new cylinder, and either over tightened or under tightened some of those, and which caused micro cracking, which after enough vibration and time caused a couple of those bolts to break, which would have broken the seal, which would have caused problems. Now, can a broken gasket seal on a cylinder leak oil from the engine? Absolutely, it can. Okay, it can cause all kinds of problems. Would it cause a shining style elevator blood opening, oil pouring out of the engine all over the wing? No, it would not. Because the engine, again, is enclosed inside the cowling. So what you would have gotten was oil inside the cowling and maybe leaking out a little bit. Maybe when you landed, right? But it would not have been this fountain of burning oil, okay? So that's what caused the rough running engine. So following the events that took place then, we know that all events were reported to the FAA on a service difficulty report. And this is a document that follows aircraft malfunctions, failures, and defects with components, okay? So they would have reported that they had this issue with this engine to the FAA on this specific form. And in the documentation, it says that the General Aviation District Office did in fact investigate all three of them and found that SkyWest had no deficiencies in their operations. So it was investigated, it was reported to the FAA. The General Aviation Office in Salt Lake City investigated it and found that there was no issues. Again, this is not a big deal. And then following the SDR report that was turned in, Lycoming sent out a representative to retrain all the pilots on the engine. That's it. That's how it was happened. There was no escalation after that.
And that shows you how careful they are about this, because what did we say? They had 3 airplanes at the time. Mm-hmm. And that they send out a manufacturer representative to train the pilots of this airline that only has 3 airplanes. That shows you how safety oriented the aviation industry is, and why this kind of stuff, if it was anything worse than that, it would have had far more eyes on it than a factory rep coming out to talk about the engine.
Yeah, and so the SDR report, that's actually taken by the FAA. Then they compile all of those and they take the information and they make it available to the industry. So anybody else using a Lycoming engine, if they wanted to, they could look up that event and say, oh my gosh, this happened to them. So it's used to correlate safety information for all aviation users and all companies. So, I mean, we know it was documented. So I've had a couple people who have said, well, could the pilot have done, and so the same people who will say, well, it was a small incident, it probably wasn't reported, we don't have to worry about it, just have faith. Some people will say, well, could the pilot have done an emergency descent? That would have felt like a death spiral if you didn't know what the pilot was doing, right? So there is a maneuver called an emergency descent, which all pilots are trained on, okay? It doesn't matter whether you're flying a Boeing 777 or a Piper Navajo. This is how you this is how you bleed off a lot of altitude very, very quickly. Now, outside of training, an emergency descent is usually only triggered in the worst case scenario. So explosive decompression of an airliner. Yes, you're going to do an emergency descent. An uncontrolled engine fire, then yes, you are going to do an emergency descent, okay? And the goal is to get as low as possible, as quickly as possible, so that you can land that plane safely, okay? So you could see where somebody making an apologetic could say, well, this could feel like a death spiral. So it is possible that if the pilot wanted to bleed off altitude as quickly as possible, he could have taken measures to bleed off altitude, which would have been probably like a slip to landing, which is where the airplane's flying straight, but you're going to cant that aircraft at a certain degree, and it reduces lift over the wing, so it causes you to fall like this, right? Instead of going straight, you're going to go down. Did a true emergency descent maneuver happen? I don't think that would have happened because they're very risky, first of all. And secondly, there's no record to indicate that an in-flight fire ever took place, which would have instigated the emergency descent. That would have been in an investigation, which would have been why did the pilot initiate the descent, and that documentation does not exist. So I don't think that would have happened.
So just hearing shaking or feeling shaking and hearing a sound would not make a pilot go. Whoop.
No.
There's just no reason for
exact opposite. You don't give up altitude until you know what you're facing, because altitude is your friend.
You can't get it back once you lose it.
Yeah, once you go down, you can't get it back. And so it would be possible. I could see the pilot staying higher on his approach to the airport, because he does only have one engine and he doesn't want to undershoot. He'd rather land long than land short. So I could see him coming in high and circling maybe to lose altitude as he came down. I wasn't sure. I was just looking it up. I'm not sure if this was a pressurized aircraft or not, which can make quite a bit of difference. And I don't know what altitude. We never hear, what altitude they were at. But a pressurized aircraft, obviously, if you're above certain altitudes, you don't have oxygen, so you have to descend rather rapidly if you lose pressurization. But they never said it. That would have been on a report as well if they'd have lost pressurization.
So 12,500, I believe, is the floor for a pressurized aircraft. I don't think they would have been traveling at 12,000 feet going between Salt Lake and St. George. So
I keep trying to think of myself if I had been in a plane where this happened. And I know I would have told people about it because it is different, for a novice flyer. And I would have said something like, yeah, we heard all this and it was really, really shaking. I was nervous. And then we landed somewhere else. I think that's what I would have said.
It happens that's really all the time.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I can't understand the element of adding this fire, because a normal person would just say there was shaking, it was weird, and we landed somewhere else, but then we got where we went on time anyway. I mean, that's all you would say, unless you were really trying to fabricate something.
Yeah, this would be akin to me getting on a flight and flying to Florida and telling people that the engine caught on fire and we landed in, Myrtle Beach.
Yeah.
And then just having it be just a bird strike where they turned off the engine and landed. Okay. This is not a big deal. So
I was going to say the same thing. This reminds me of a bird strike, and almost anyone who travels extensively knows someone who has been on an aircraft. When the bird strike happened, they turn the plane around, they land wherever they took off. Usually a bird strike happens when you're taking off or landing, because that's when you're at the altitude the birds are at. So usually it'll turn right around and land, or it'll continue to land wherever it was going to. But bird strikes happen all the time in aviation, and that's almost the equivalent. I mean, he did shut down an engine, but a lot of times a bird strike will go in an engine and impact it. But this happens all the time.
Yep.
It's not something that causes people to recount their life when they turn around because of a bird strike,
So what we can say did in fact happen because of the documentation. We can say that Nelson was on a flight on November 11th on his way to St. George. Happened. We can say that during the flight, the pilot did experience a rough running engine, and that the pilot shut down the engine and feathered the prop according to company policy. We know that happened. The pilot did make a precautionary landing in Delta, Utah in accordance with the company policy. Another plane was dispatched to finish the flight. Evidently, Nelson was on time for his event, because it says so. SkyWest reported the incident to the FAA on a service difficulty report form that is used to talk about component malfunctions and failures. And because of the rough running engine the cause was found to be seared cylinder bolts. But how many were damaged is not specified. That's it. That's all we can say did in fact happen. Okay. So
I'm not so inspired by that. I mean, that doesn't really,
yeah,
I'm not going to change my life because of the bolts. It just doesn't do it for me. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. And so let's talk about what we say cannot say happened. There's no evidence for an in-flight fire. There is no evidence for an engine explosion. There is no evidence for burning oil. There is no evidence for turning off the left engine. There is no evidence for the loss of control of the aircraft. There is no evidence for the loss of lift or spiral out of the sky. There is no evidence for an intentional dive to extinguish flames. There is no evidence for last-minute regaining of control, because control is never lost. And there is no evidence for an emergency landing in a farmer's field, okay? There is no documentation evidence from the CAB, the NTSB, the FAA, or any other alphabet agency that has events that even closely resemble Nelson's claims. That's just not history.
And so, there's no event recorded in KSL, the other alphabet, that Utah news agency that would have covered this. It had a commercial aircraft landed in a farmer's field.
Well, you can see right here,
there
they
you
did
go.
cover it. A leader of the LDS Church survived a scary incident today on Sky West as an in-flight fire forced an emergency landing in Farmer Nephi's field. And what that means for your weekend at 9. So
that did not happen.
Yeah, that's what should exist. Like there should be newspapers. So we're missing other cultural elements, right? Why have none of the other aircraft survivors come on? There's at least 4 other people in that plane. Mm-hmm. Why have none of them ever spoken about this? If it's this narrative, someone could have said, hey, I was on that plane with President Nelson. I was there. I was right next to him. His piece, this would have been, can you imagine a church news article where they get the guy sitting next to Nelson? His piece radiated. Yeah. I survived this crash because I looked over at Nelson and he practically turned into Joseph Smith while sitting there, and he took my hand and he said, this is going to be okay. That story, I would have eaten that up, right? Yeah. That story should be there.
I feel like they had to sign NDAs and they might have been paid something, or their kids given tuition to BYU. It reminds me of the gun held to the head. There was a mission president there, a mission president's wife, I think another couple. There were other couples there that there were no firearms and no gun was held to his head. And the other story that he's told where there's similar, we believe, exaggeration, none of these people have come forward, I believe, because they're all faithful. And why would you dare do that? Why would you?
We're conditioned not to. Mm-hmm. More importantly, in the Mozambique attack, there was a letter sent by the mission president to the missionaries' families that does not hold up the same information.
Yeah.
I think RFM has a copy of that letter. I would love to get that because that's something else that needs to be gone through. So no one ever interviewed the pilot. He had a general authority on the plane. Why has nobody from 1979 to 2019 or 2021 ever interviewed the pilot of that plane? There are no pictures of the crash. If you're out there in Utah, that's a pretty boring area of Utah, that drive between Spanish Fork and not a lot happens there. So if you have a random airplane in the field, then somebody's going to come out and take a picture. There's no newspaper articles, no news reports, no contemporary references to the event ever until Nelson has it in his book. Now, maybe somebody out there can find some reference. If they can find a reference, great, bring it forward. I'll re-examine all of this at that point, right? But from what I can find, from what RFM can find, Bill Reel, everybody out there that's looked, there's no contemporary corroborating evidence for this. Okay, and the cultural stuff should be there.
It should be there. I think about, oh my gosh, look at that. Before we go to fair, I think about when Paul H. Dunn, if you guys remember that, he was a wonderful storyteller, as we found out. He was so inspiring. He was so popular. As soon as they figured out that what he was telling was not completely factual, the person that he said had died in his arms, I think in the army or something, came forward and said, I'm not dead. They made him emeritus really quickly. Like, they took care of it. This is a similar situation. So many people understand these stories are fabricated, yet, there's been absolutely crickets pretty much from leadership. Paul H. Dunn instantly removed, nothing here.
Yep. Well, if you remember, the woman in the red hat story was removed from the same Sherry Dew biography that this story shows up in.
Yep, they've censured Holland and the other one about the 2 brothers meeting in the mission field, things like that, where family comes forward and says that's not really how it is. Those have been addressed and taken care of, but these aren't stories from Nelson, right? These are stories from other apostles. So maybe it's just, you don't touch the prophet's story. You just don't.
In the Holland account, that was a story that he had heard from somebody else, and so he was using it. The problem that this account raises for the church is you now have a couple of different stories that show up where that undermine the credibility of the speaker. Mm-hmm. Because if this is false, what other narratives has he told that are false? Well, we know the woman in the red hat was. Mm-hmm. This is why Oakes said years ago that you don't question the leaders of the church, even if the story is true. Because when this kind of information comes out, it causes that cognitive dissonance. It did for me. For me, this was like, well, okay, this doesn't add up. And it was one of those issues that led me to questioning everything else, right? So, and that's what FAIR tries to stop us from doing.
Exactly. It unravels the thread. I mean, now I'm even questioning the crushed water bottle story. Were they really eating lunch? Was there a water bottle?
Was there a lunch?
Was there even lunch? I know that's the thing. It's a rabbit hole.
We were at dinner last night with a guy that we met at the
Thrive.
At Thrive, and he actually he said the way you do things is the way you do things. I think that's the way he said it. But
it was sort of like that. Yeah.
Basically, his point was when you find somebody doing something one way, that's the way they do things all the time. Yep. And with Nelson, when we start looking at this, we just see pattern after pattern after pattern of these exaggerated stories. We remember him telling the story of how the November 15th policy, what a wonderful revelation that was. And we go back and all the other general authorities are going, no, that's not what happened. No, it was not. It was a policy. It was not a unanimous. And we see the story with the lady in the red hat. We see the story with the airplane. We see the story.
It's a pattern of exaggeration.
Yes,
it's a pattern. Yeah,
we see this pattern.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up about what we heard last night at our dinner after Thrive. How you do anything is how you do anything, because, and in this case, the person was talking about learning about the SEC fine and the shell companies. And this person had a background in that. And he thought right away, oh boy, if the church is doing this with this is the kind of stuff that's happening in other areas of what they're doing. And it just sends you down that rabbit hole. And everybody has a different thing that kind of, I don't know, gets through to them or triggers that, but that's always what happens. You find one thread and then it just starts to unravel. That's why it's important to talk about these stories. I mean, we kind of make light or but it's really representational of a whole systematic decision of how you do everything. That's why I think it's so important to cover. So we appreciate Jim bringing all this to us.
Well, like the thing is too, right, is when like the SEC, when that came out, that was like it for me. Like I knew at that point that was like I had stuff piling up for years, and I read the church's response to that. And there was a question in there that said, did the church break the law? Something like that. The response said the church came to a settlement with the SEC. And I remember reading that. I was like, that's not the question that they asked, right? And then there was like this blaming of attorneys. And then when you go back and you read the SEC statement, if the SEC felt that it was bad advice from attorneys, it would have showed up again in the documentation. Mm-hmm. The documentation on the SEC said nothing about bad attorneys, right? But that's what the church blamed it on. And that's why going back and reading documentation is so important, right? It's like the footnotes on the Gospel Topics essays. That will kill you fast. But yeah, so it's this pattern of telling a story, and then if the story doesn't match up to documents, it's okay. There's more out there, right? And that's what FAIR does here. FAIR, for anybody who does want to look this up, what they say is really, really it's dishonest. So I think about FAIR, and I'm just reminded of that scene from The Naked Gun, where, again, on the screen here, where you have the factory exploding and Frank Drebin's like, nothing to see here, please disperse. That has become my metaphor for all LDS apologetics. And I used to be very involved in apologetics. I ate and I would eat and breathe apologetics. I owned everything.
And for those that don't know what FAIR is, we do have Never Mormons that watch. So I have to remind myself, it is, as Jim said, an apologetic organization, not connected to the church, but supporting sort of the church, people that on their own have just gathered together. And when you hear something like this, they'll go, oh, this is how you can think of it. They explain away things that may be problematic.
Well, they teach you how to compartmentalize the knowledge based upon approved sources, right? So this is from the FAIR website. It says, did Russell M. Nelson exaggerate his story about being in a falling airplane? And they quote, it says, from 1976, Russell M. Nelson was in a small commuter airplane traveling from Salt Lake to St. George. During the flight, the plane experienced engine trouble and rapidly decreased altitude. Okay. Now, even their description of the flight itself does not match what Nelson says next. So in their own language, they downplay the statement itself. And it's Nelson's quote from the 1992 Doors of Death. And it just says, I remember vividly an experience I had in a passenger in a small two-propeller airplane. One of its engines suddenly burst open and caught fire. The propeller spewing the propeller of the flaming engine was starkly stilled. We plummeted in a steep spiral dive towards the earth, and I expected to die. Some of the passengers were screaming hysterically. Miraculously, the precipitous dive extinguished the flames. Then, by starting up the other engine, which Landon and I are both like, what? The pilot was able to stabilize the plane, meaning he had lost control to begin with, and bring us down safely. Now, notice what they've done here. They have quoted one version, okay? Only reference is to the Doors of Death from the 1992 General Conference, does not inform the readers that there's multiple accounts. They don't say this is an often referenced core element of Nelson's life. They give you one.
I will say the church is notorious for hiding other accounts, right? Until they absolutely have to bring them forward.
And only referring to the most faith-promoting account, or in this case, the one that has the least details that they can point to. Yeah.
So we're going to call this the SkyWest 1838 account, and we'll call the other ones will be the 1832 accounts. And then they try to explain what happened. And when I read this, I was just like, so it says, according to the Federal Aviation Summary of the next year, this accident was one of three involving SkyWest Airlines over the course of a month. Now, I'll tell you something. The use of the word accident here means it would have been investigated. This was an incident, okay? There's a difference between an incident and an accident. The fact that they say accident means that everything we've talked about for the last hour should exist. But then they say something that's just not attached to reality. They say, as a result, the Civil Aeronautics Board temporarily suspended SkyWest's authorization to fly to certain airports. I don't know where that came from. And then it says, as part of the proceedings, and then they quote the document that we have, right? So this is factually incorrect. Fair LDS evidently did not even read the source material they cited for their own apologetic, okay? The source material addresses concerns raised by Page, Arizona, like we discussed, and a letter that they wrote to the CAB giving their insight into the loss of commercial service in Page, right? And I've got the order of the letter right there. The CAB took their concerns very seriously and asked the FAA to produce the document that we have. And there was no suspension for SkyWest. I don't know where that came from, but anybody who's getting their information from FAIR is automatically misinformed because that never happened. And the portion of the letter is right here. It says, a variety of pleadings are currently pending this proceedings. One of those pleadings is a reply to the town of Page, Arizona's the town of Page to Air West's answer to Page's motion to stay the pending for judicial review. Basically, Page was saying, we don't necessarily want this service to end. We're not sure about SkyWest. And so we're gonna trigger the questions to be asked. And it says, this is the quote from Page, Arizona. It says, so far as the reliability of SkyWest service is concerned, the fact that the company has experienced 3 emergency landings in the last 3 months should be noted. That is exactly what triggered the document, okay? There was no reference to them losing or suspending different airports. SkyWest was trying to get access to more airports, which is why this came up. Okay, so SkyWest is just ignorant on the documentation. And then they move forward with a treadmill of nonsense, which is what most of FAIR is, but that's what this is. They say, because the summary report does not mention a fire, which we know if there was a fire, there would be documentation, some have wondered if this means President Nelson exaggerated his story. It is important to remember that this is a summary, that this summary is not the investigative report of the incident, and thus would not include complete details regarding the investigation. And then they say, this is important because the fire that Nelson saw was likely the result of burning fuel leaking from the engine. Thus, it is not necessary that the mechanical components of the engine burned in order for the engine to appear to be on fire. So they're saying, well, it was just leaking fuel, and that leaking fuel happened to be on fire. Okay? Thus, the summary report would state that there was no engine damage, while at the same time there was a fire during the incident. Now, from what we've learned, if there was a fire, there's an investigation. If there's an investigation, there's documentation. If there's documentation, there is fact. Okay? Everything that even the idea that a fuel line inside the engine would break and you would see flaming fire coming out of it, that's going to burn components. That's going to burn wiring. That's going to burn the cables that run from your spark plugs into your cylinder. That's going to burn the cowling. You can't just scrub fire off the cowling, right? And then what don't they mention? This is it. This is the whole apologetic. They don't talk about the dive. They don't talk about the fact that there's a disconnect between the spin, the out of control spin, and the intentional dive to put out the fire. They don't even address the fact that the document that they quote states that they landed in Delta, Utah, when Nelson himself says that they landed in a farmer's field. Okay? So anybody who goes to FAIR for any kind of information, this is the kind of garbage that they pull where they don't even tell you what's in the document itself. They can't quote the document right, and they're giving people a false sense of what actually happened. So it's not just about the fire.
While you're still on this slide, because this is what we see from Mormon apologetics all the time. Obviously, we talked about Paul H. Dunn. Paul H. Dunn was not the prophet. They could go ahead and put him into retirement. You can't put the prophet into retirement. Therefore, they have to make this work. This story has to work, and this is how all Mormon apologetics work. They have to make it work somehow, and they come up with whatever story they have to make it work and make it look like they've looked into it and found the answers. And exactly as the slide before says, they're telling you, no, you don't have to look here. We've already looked for you. There's nothing to see here. Continue with your way. This highlighted section right here on the top where it says, it is important to remember that this summary is not the investigative report of the incident and thus would not include complete details regarding the investigation. Okay, right there. You said this is not the investigative report. So someone who's actually investigating this and trying to determine what happened should say, well, let's go to the investigative report. Yeah. And what happens? There is no investigative report. That should have been the very first clue that something is wrong here. That's exactly what Jim has done. He said, okay, let's go to the investigative report. Oh, strike. There is no investigative report. It should have been there. I'm guessing they know there's no investigative report, and that's why they say, oh, it's just a summary. The investigative report would have told the whole story, but they know it doesn't exist. So they just
because no story.
If they were to treat this event in any higher detail, all of a sudden they have to grapple with the official narrative not being what was told. They have to deal with the lack of fire. They have to deal with specifically, they have to deal with the landing in the farmer's field. Okay. That is beyond, he misremembered that. Okay. Because it shows up in multiple accounts and the biography. Okay. Now you'll notice Nelson says, like in the video where he says it, he's like, we landed in a farmer's field, like that really folksy way he says things. Yeah. Like, can you believe that? How crazy is that? Right. But to try to investigate this matter any further puts them in a situation where they now have to confront the fact that what is alleged does not exist. And so what they're going to do is what apologists will do is they'll treat it at a high level, and then they make people believe that there's a document that does not exist. Okay, this is the lost scroll theory for the plane crash. Because what they're saying is, this is not the investigative report. The investigative report has all the information. You don't need to worry about the fact that that investigative report exists. Don't worry about it. Just this is what we have. So this is the Lost Scroll version where it's like, well, the Lost Scroll has everything. The investigative report has anything, but none of it's real, right? So I call that the Kerry, I can't say his last name. Assume it's true and go from there. Fair, like you said, Fair probably does not understand that there was no investigation into the event. They probably didn't give it that much time. This is an apologetic that was slapped together in response to RFM. Okay, and they didn't even go as far as was necessary. They are leading readers to believe that there's an investigative report that contains all the details, which simply does not exist. They selectively address the fact that Nelson claims to have seen fire and then guess that it might have been, okay, which is like the Gospel Topics essays. Maybe he thought, or perhaps he realized, right?
You can think of it this way.
Yeah, anytime, if you squint your eyes the right way, anytime we're dealing with an issue where the facts don't match up, they always throw those weasel words in there. It's perhaps he felt this, maybe he thought that. Well, that's what they've done here. It might have been burning fuel coming from the engine. Well, that's not the way it works. And then, none of this is supported by the description of a rough running engine which will shut down as a precaution. They did not even attempt to address the landing in the field, which is directly contradicted by the CAV document that they cite themselves.
And that's not something you remember wrong. Landing in a field where you had to get out and you're in the middle of nowhere and you've got to walk somewhere or get help somehow is completely different than landing at an airport where they send another plane to pick you up. You don't forget those details.
Nope.
Not 3 years later, you don't, because that's the gap.
Completely fabricated, right? And then the documentation. So all this calls into credibility, the entire narrative, and Nelson into question. So Fair just opts to not even raise these issues with the reader at all. So if you're a young flight student in Utah and you are interested in this and you start looking at it, Fair wants you not to worry about it. But for me, the reason why all of this is important, okay, is I don't think that anybody should invest themselves in any cause or any movement or any organization that does not stand up to scrutiny, right? If you have a personal question, you want to work through the various ways you could be wrong, okay? And a great definition of a fanatic is somebody who is proud of the fact that they will not consider how they might be wrong, okay? That makes people fanatical, okay? So when you're fed a narrative from somebody who's in a position of power and they're telling you to trust them, and then you start digging in it and realize that one of the core narratives that makes up their spiritual experience of why you should mimic them, why you should follow their lead. Who doesn't want to feel peace in moments of trial? Who doesn't I had a situation years ago where I had a child who was hospitalized, and I did not feel peace in that situation. I was constantly awash in concern for him, concern for the stress on my wife, concern for all kinds of stuff. But everybody wants to look at situations in their life and they want to feel peace. They want to feel that wash over. They want to feel assured, right? So this story from Nelson and the gunshot story, those offer people this pathway. It's like if you follow what Nelson has done, you can have the same peace, okay? Well, when you find out that the narrative that you are investing yourself in as part of this concept that you should follow what is false, okay? Why tell a lie? He said plenty of times where he's held people's hearts in their hands. This is a guy who saved lives. So why create the false narrative? I believe he created it to elevate his spiritual status because he was gunning for general authority. This is before 1985. This is before he was a general authority. So I feel like the whole idea was raised to him so he could create that persona, that spiritual giant concept. Later on, he uses it as our temple work was done. My children were all sealed to me. I had both my wives. We're in great shape. And so it turns into this whole thing of that you only get to where he is by complete obedience to the organization in which he found his peace. And I'm not okay with being lied to. And I'm not being okay with being lied to when it's especially something that I'm going to give my time, my money, my efforts, and I'm going to tell my kids that they should do the same thing, right? So it's a small example of a much greater problem that exists within the church. And it's something that Nemo took on. Look what happened to him. But Nemo's purpose was to get the church to do better. This hopefully will help. Well, it's not going to help the church do better. I'm probably going to get in trouble for that. But
I hope not.
The whole process of examining and looking at the facts should be what the church points us to. It should not be something we don't do for error of undermining somebody in authority. Because if somebody in authority is telling us stuff that's not true, they should not be in authority. They should not be there. And just because they're the oldest person who got to the position doesn't mean that what they said in 1979 or 1975 or 1992 or 1994 or 2011 is true, right? And so I would say that the church needs to come back and say, okay, this is not necessarily a true narrative, which they'll never do. But I wish that they would do what they did with Holland's story and just say, okay, some facts are messed up. But it's hard. It's hard when you are a true believing member and you want desperately for things to be true, and you start digging into things and you use your own expertise or your own knowledge, and you start finding out that things are not correct. And it's just a very difficult place to be. So that's kind of everything I've got, everything that came together. I hope that people who have a chance to look at this will have a better understanding as to what documentation exists, where it came from, why that documentation is important. And yeah, that's everything I've got, y'all.
I appreciate this, Jim, and I want to point out, what you said, just kind of build on what you said. Nelson was an accomplished heart surgeon. No one's going to deny that. He has all kinds of stories that I'm sure he could tell that are true. It would paint a good picture of him. So why does he have to go to these false narratives? What's the purpose? And when you start examining this in the way that we just did, we see that, he's trying to paint a picture of him as a spiritual giant, as someone who's at peace with the gospel. But when we examine the evidence and find out that the story's not true, we actually see the opposite happen. We see someone who is very narcissistic because they have to paint themselves to look better than they really are. They have to make up stories to make them what they are. And in this case, when you have a man who's on an aircraft that didn't have an emergency landing, that just simply had a maintenance issue, that they made a precautionary landing and got him to the place on time. And he uses this as the driving force to write his book and his life history. That shows you that he's absolutely terrified of that he's going to lose his life. This little precautionary landing scared him so much that he had to write his life history in a book and record it for everybody because he was frightened by the experience.
Yeah.
Think about how much different this entire this conversation would not be happening is if he wrote it like this. And I've thought about this a lot. It says, on November 2nd, on November 12th, I was on a small airplane. And while flying between Salt Lake and St. George, the aircraft experienced problems. And I was extremely uneasy about this. I wasn't sure what could happen next. But the pilot, following his training, was able to take care of the engine and land the plane. And what I carried away from that experience was it's important to be prepared, that the Lord gives us skills and helps us prepare for these events, because you never know when your personal preparation is going to have others involved, right? I did have an experience in flight school that scared the life out of me. It was not a crash, right? I just screwed up while I was flying. But I had a checklist there, and that was the message I took away from my personal experience, right? That preparation, that God would give you the tools you need, and that through personal preparation, I was able to take care of myself and return to my family, and everything was great, right? That would have been a very good message, but it lacked what it lacks is that hook, is that moment of it's like in the Book of Mormon, where every battle is 50 times larger, right? It's 10,000 people rather than just this tribe fought against. It's 220,000 people showing up. It's this expanded concept of the emotional appeal of the whole thing. So when you're listening to Nelson talk, him saying, "Well, the plane had some problems, but I walked away happy." Dude, the engine exploded. Now the audience is they're going to tune in, right? It's showmanship. It's demurred showmanship, but it's showmanship.
No,
Well, to
it isn't.
me,
Your story was inspiring. I was inspired by what you just said. The other thing missing in the version that you told is there's no counterpart to Nelson. In each of his stories, there's someone else that doesn't get it like he
That's
did.
right.
He has special knowledge. There's a terrified person. Even the people in the mission experience in the mission home, they weren't like him. He had peace. So he has to have something others don't. And how can you get that he has, that the others don't? The terrified atheist, the screaming woman. There's always a counterpoint.
Yeah. The woman in the hat who didn't have the gospel and didn't
mm-hmm,
have peace and asked him why he was so much different than all the other doctors.
Yep. That's always
You're right. There's always a straight man for him to play off of for his status compared to their lack of status.
Yep.
And that's the narcissism, and the difference between the story you told and the story that he told is in the story you told, the pilot was the one prepared. Mm-hmm. In his story, it was him that was prepared. Yeah. It has to be about him.
Because the pilot lost control.
Yep.
Yeah. He was the only one in control because of, his peace and probably second anointing. So I just also think, look at all the stories they tell recently. Miracles are dead. There are no more miracles. They're making stories out of, who was it that brought resurrected a gnat? We've got a water bottle. We've got, just these things that it's like every day they're walking around let's see. I dropped a banana. How can I make that inspiring? They've got to find something.
Look at the pattern for a conference talk, right?
Yeah.
We don't have like sermons. It's not like they're taking a portion of scripture and saying, okay, I'm going to sermonize on the context of this and apply it. There's a pattern for everything we do in conference, and that is introduce yourself, tell a story, create a message. And you'll notice every message we get in conference is, I received a letter, but we don't get details. We get these vague notions that kind of fit into what they want to say. Yeah. And so they have to create something every single time. And the speech writers have to be able to create something that has some sort of emotional element. I would give nothing more. I would love to go to church and have somebody with a background in theology stand up and say, hey, today we're going to discuss John. Let's discuss the background of John. Let's discuss the culture. Why is it important? And give us a lecture on it. But we don't get that. What we get is spiritual Twinkies. We get these stories that have shape. They're well shaped, but there's not much in them. And all of our messages now in the church are designed not for us to look outside the church, not for us to look for information anywhere else, but for us to turn our attention right back and look at the leadership, which is why they have the bullet points now. So you can go through the talks, and you can go through and we rehearse what the leaders have said. There's a lady on Reddit who was talking about the fact that she was given an assignment to talk 12 minutes on a talk that was given last conference. Everything that we do is designed to turn us around and have us look at the leadership, but not have us look critically at anything. Mm-hmm. And that's where these kind of stories come up. There's a statement. Let's see here. I was looking at it the other day, and I'll end with this. Hold on a second. From the Improvement Era, and I don't know what year it was.
It must have been a while ago if it's still called the Improvement Era.
It says that Satan, let's see here. Satan wins his greatest victory when he can get members to speak against the leaders and to do their own thinking. And that was from, June 1945. Ward Teacher's Message for June 1945. So doing your own thinking is a victory for Satan. Yeah. Which is why I still use the word Mormon. So
that's right, which is why we're Mormonish. No, and we have seen a rise in that kind of thought, where we had the information from the lecture given to the BYU Law School, where the General Authority Emeritus said to these critically thinking lawyers, because they're sharp, they're in law school, and he said, sure, use those skills, head thinking for this, but when it comes to the church, heart thinking. Yep. So they're doing this. They're having to point out to people, you don't use your critical thinking when it comes to religion. You just don't, because it doesn't stand up to the scrutiny.
Yep. And so I think general faith does, because faith is so subjective.
Exactly.
Right. But when it comes to institutions trying to justify their existence, what we just practiced here today, looking at documentation, looking at information and comparing it to sources, it doesn't do well. So
No, wow,
Yeah.
this has been great. Landon, do you have any final thoughts on this? This has been just, it's not just the airplane story. It's just the tip of the iceberg of
It's
a
what
bigger
the airplane story represents.
systemic,
Yep.
yes, exactly, systemic scenario. So
I just want to thank Jim. We talked about this when he called me a couple of weeks ago, and that this is exactly what we talked about, is that the story was more than just this airplane story. It's the way that it's covered, the way it's covered up, the way that it's a constant pattern that we see, and that is really the important part of this message. Is this is what we get from Mormon apologetics, and this is what we get from Mormon leaders. Is these what'd you call it? A spiritual Twinkie?
a spiritual Twinkie, that's a real thing.
Treadmill of nonsense. Those
I
are
love
all
that,
terms
the
I
treadmill
throw
of
around.
nonsense.
Those were great, but a lot of work went into this. Jim did a lot of investigation, looked for what should be there that wasn't. Just a great job. Really appreciate it, Jim. And when you're in Salt Lake, look us up. We'd love to go.
We'll go to
get lunch or something.
Yeah, can you take us off screen share, Landon, just as we wrap up here? Yeah, this is just amazing. So perfect. There we are. Now I can see everybody, right? Instead.
Yeah. No, I'll be out there. I'll be out there in March. So I'll swing by in March.
That's excellent. No, this is just wonderful. And I just love it when I just come across somebody, I'm like, this person is awesome. I hope I can get them to come on the show. And we were talking before we started, flipped on so we could podcast, or we may see Jim again. There's some other things we were talking about that he has some good information. So I just
now that we have our own Mormonish aviation consultant, Uchtdorf is no longer safe.
Well, so you just opened a pot of worms for me. So let me just state, I am not a commercial pilot. Okay, so I can't speak to that.
Right.
But Uchtdorf should know.
Yes.
That this is garbage. Right.
You're right.
There's
and
no
he was
way.
in charge. I think he was the main. I thought I heard he was the main
check
safety
pilot,
the check pilot for. Yeah.
So he. I mean, first of all, I love him. Okay.
Yeah. We all do.
Yeah, and so when he gives aviation analogies, he gives it right. He gave the one about slowing down to the safe minimum speeds when you're flying into heavy headwinds or shear. So I love what he has to say. But I just have to wonder, when this story comes out, do you think he ever goes, closes the book?
They ought to pan over to Uchtdorf when this story's being told in conference just to see if he winces. Or
I would love to talk to him one day.
That is such a good point. I've never thought about that. There are people who know. And like we said, there are people who actually experience these things, like the Mozambique attack and also the plane. There are a handful of people out there who know the truth. And why have they never
mysteriously silent?
Exactly. And it's interesting to me that, like you both mentioned, no news media. When we did an episode on the newscast about the Mozambique story, and RFM went through that again, I sent that off to some of my contacts in different news outlets here in Utah. I said, wouldn't this be interesting just to cover? No one will cover it. No one will cover this. So I don't know if our viewers and listeners want to put a bug in the ear of any news outlets. Now we have two stories. It's just a very interesting scenario. You don't even have to, if you'd covered it on a bigger platform, make a judgment on it. Just kind of put it out there. But nobody seems to be willing to touch it at all, which is very telling to me, I think. But it is interesting. He's a global faith leader, and he has said these things. They deserve scrutiny. They deserve transparency. They deserve a spotlight. So please let us know what you all think. Have you heard of either of these stories? I'm guessing you had. This new information that Jim brought to light was absolutely fascinating. The documents that should be there, that aren't there, that indicate what really happened. And this is absolutely fascinating. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you would like to make a donation to Mormonish Podcast, we do have links in our show notes to donor box. And I'm going to have to say this is hilarious. So we had this wonderful person that reached out and donated. That's awesome. And they left a message, as they often do. And they said, Rebecca, do you realize that when you tell people you're a nonprofit, you probably haven't even noticed I've done this either, Landon, I have been saying 501(c). I know better than that. I don't know why my brain is glitching. I'm not saying it right. So from now on, I'm just going to say we're a freaking nonprofit. So especially if you're thinking of your end of year donations, you can always think of Mormonish. We so appreciate everybody that does. And thanks for that wonderful donor who said, Rebecca, stop saying that. You're having a brain cramp or something. So we appreciate you. That's awesome. And we also have links in the show notes to our merch store if you want to pick up a mug or a hat or a t-shirt. And again, Jim, just thank you so much for everything that you brought. And it was amazing to get to know you. And like I said, we're going to pick Jim's brain on some
We'll
other
see you again
things,
soon.
because he's a super smart individual. And we're really, really glad that we connected. And thanks again, Landon, for co-hosting. And we'll say goodbye one more time, but we'll see you again on Mormonish Podcast. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.